William Still wanted his readers to see that those people who escaped enslavement, they were people with real stories and flesh and blood and maybe no toes and scars and tears and also joys and loves, and that they were agents of their own liberation. I created this image on the screen to help us imagine those faces freed, taking wing in that liberation that they were able to find. I think William Still and Elizabeth that he wrote about, and Frederick Douglass and Sherry Mills and Christina Cleveland and Nicole Hannah-Jones and countless others would say, don't stop there. They'd want us to look for our own faces among those others, one body with them in Christ, and us like them, becoming agents of our own liberation. So during this season, we've been working with this devotional, Lent of Liberation, that many of us are following this. I got 15 copies, and they're all taken, and I couldn't get more within about 2 weeks. And so if you want to follow this, you'll have to do it online and get an e-reader, because that'd be the fastest way to get it. It's by Sherry Mills, and every day she includes a story of an enslaved person, or sometimes it's a group of family members who have left or escaped the bondage of slavery through the Underground Railroad. You know the Underground Railroad, this network of secret routes and safe houses. It's not literally an underground railroad. You get that, right? I mean, sometimes I think people get a little confused about that. But the stories that get told here about from the Underground Railroad come from a book called The Underground Railroad, a record that was published in 1872 by William Still, who has been described as the father of the Underground Railroad. I read in one place that he was born into slavery and escaped with his mother when he was very young, and then another place it said that he was born to parents who had escaped slavery, but he was born free. It's not easy to figure all that out from that time. Either way, he committed his life to assisting black persons to freedom after they had left the bondage of slavery and he was in Philadelphia, so the people who came through Philadelphia, through the Underground Railroad, he was the person who would assist them. Maybe 800 people through that Philadelphia station while he was assisting there. And by the way, if you're like me and you've thought of the Underground Railroad as sort of good white people, helping out these people who had escaped slavery, the more I read about that, the less that seems true, that the majority of people who were working through this system were actually freed blacks. And there were whites clearly along the way, but maybe not as many as you and I might like to think. In his account of many of their stories, these hundreds of stories of the people who the Underground Railroad assisted, it's really interesting that William Still doesn't dwell on the great work that the Underground Railroad people did. Instead, he makes these fugitive slaves the heroes. And it was written of him, he wanted readers to understand that the fugitive slaves were the engine of the Underground Railroad. They were agents in their own liberation. And I love that he tells this story so as to emphasize that. On day 15 of our devotional, the story that gets told is of Elizabeth, who fled to Pennsylvania with her brother during the winter, and it was so cold, 4 days and 4 nights in the bitter cold, and they couldn't have a fire because, the smoke and the light would give them away. So they made it to the Philadelphia station, but Elizabeth lost all of her toes. She was only 20 years old, unable to walk for 7 months. William Still records Elizabeth saying, even though she suffered so severely, because she had been so determined to leave where she had been enslaved, she had no regrets. In fact, as she would put it, the loss of her toes was a good bargain versus the unimaginable horror and utter brutality of slavery. So Sherry Mills tells stories like that. And then she very bluntly speaks of the realities in that time, as well as the continuing impact of racism in our country. And if that weren't enough, at the end of each day's reflection, she'll ask a question like, well, here's the one from day 15, that essentially asks, okay, so I've shared this information. What are you going to do about it? What would you be willing to sacrifice? The way Elizabeth sacrificed her toes, are we willing to sacrifice anything? Much? Like what would we be willing to do to be in solidarity with people who still are paying the price of the continuing legacy of slavery? Every dang day, it's like this. The question is really in your face. What are you gonna do? And those of us who've been talking about this book are like, oh my gosh, it's kind of hard to come to those questions day after day. Okay, so what action are you going to take? What sacrifice would we make? Would you pray with me? Holy and gracious God, we haven't been in church this long without knowing that following Christ is going to mean giving some things up and making sacrifices, walking alongside him on the way to the cross in ways that are going to be hard sometimes, and call things of us that we wouldn't have picked. As we think about that today through this devotional that we're following, through this conversation that we're having about what liberation looks like, even of our own spirits, out of this legacy of American slavery and the continuing effects of racism, we'd ask that the words that I say and the meditations of every one of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight. Oh God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I have to say, this thing that we're doing together during this season of Lent, this is hard. Lent, this season where you kind of prepare to come to Easter more free. If we're doing it right, it's never going to be easy. Self-examination and discipline and kind of excavating ourselves out of whatever we've covered ourselves up with. And this year we're doing that together, especially around this really hard history that, you know, we might just want to opt out of the whole thing. And I have to say, I appreciate that you're still showing up. And I hear from you that you get it. At least a lot of you get it, that we have work to do around this. So this conversation is part of that. When we get in touch with these questions of the legacy of slavery and what we're supposed to do, it's a real question. Like, what can we do? Where do we start? That was the question Christina Cleveland was asked the first time I knew who she was. She's the one I introduced you to last week, who spoke at a conference that I attended in Albuquerque in July of 2016. She spoke, and then there was a Q&A afterwards, and during that Q&A, someone asked her, well, what are we supposed to do about all this? This was just a couple of weeks after Philando Castile was shot. Do you know his story? He was a 30-year-old African-American man in the Minneapolis area who was shot to death by police in what was within the first 74 seconds after he'd been stopped in a traffic stop. He was reaching for his ID, and the officer shot him 7 times, and he died there. It was one of too many stories like this. So a lot of us in this mostly white audience that day had that same question. What should we be doing about all this? And Christina Cleveland said, I get asked that all the time. What should we do? Is there a place for us, white people, in this work? This was really a bunch of well-meaning white people. The conference was titled Everything Belongs, and we legitimately wanted to know, what should we be doing? She was the only black speaker on the program, so this was our chance to ask her, like, really, tell us, we want to know. So Christina took her time getting to an answer to this, and she finally said, yes, there's a place for you. And we all heaved a sigh of relief, I think. And then we all kind of leaned in because it was clear she was going to tell us what our place was. Do you know what she said? Last. Your place is last. And she just let it hang there. For a lot of us, I think there was a kind of resonance there with Jesus' words, the last will be first and the first will be last. But I don't think any of us expected that answer. So after this kind of long pause, she said something of what she meant, which was essentially, you want to take part in this work? It's not about you. So yeah, there's a place for you, but don't center yourself. It's not about you feeling better. Don't ask me, people who look like me, she was saying, her, not me, her. Don't ask her to do our work. The term white fragility hadn't been coined yet then, but if it had, she would say, your white fragility is not our problem. That word last felt important and real. And it's rung in my head ever since. And it's probably why I followed Christina Cleveland for almost 8 years now. And I did that online program 2 years ago that I talked a little bit about last week, these stages of racial identity development. If you missed last week, I hope you'll go back and catch up, because we said a lot there about the first stage of our identity as people who have a racial understanding. That stage is coma. And some of you admitted to me afterwards, after last Sunday's talk, you said, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was in coma. Which, of course, is the nature of coma, right? We don't know it when we're in a coma. So today I just want to walk through the rest of the stages. We'll go a little more quickly this time. I mentioned last week that puke was the second stage, and the tendency of puke is that we're horrified because we've begun to understand what the truths are that we kind of tried to keep away from ourselves while we were in a coma. And the way that we sort of respond to that is to offer ourselves loving kindness, to find ways to do self-compassion, because we aren't going to get it right, and it's going to be confusing. And she says a practice that we can undertake to kind of work through that stage is lament, which is about naming and grieving what we've learned. So I appreciate that there's a way through puke, because we all know that's a pretty uncomfortable stage no matter when that happens to us. The next stage is trance, which she describes as when we become defensive and kind of lifeless. It becomes risky to act on what we've learned. And she tells a story that illustrates this so powerfully. She says one November, when she was serving as a college professor, she'd been teaching around race, and she had this class that was doing great work together. And she invited the class to an extra meeting right before Thanksgiving. Some racial incident had happened, and it was in the news, and so she wanted to kind of create space for people to process that. And to her surprise, it was really the white students mostly who came. And she says it was awesome. They were interested and earnest, and they wanted to keep growing. And there was this kind of communal lament about this thing that had happened that was in the news. And so that night, this week of Thanksgiving, she gave these students an optional assignment. She said, at your Thanksgiving dinner with your family, talk about this class. Talk about what you're learning. And they were all like, well, yeah, we can do that. By 9:00 p.m. that Thanksgiving night, she says she had heard from 9 of the 15, and they were just shocked by the way people and their families reacted to this conversation. She reports that among those 9 students, 3 families had disowned or kicked them out over what they had said about race, at least temporarily. One of them, their grandfather, had called them a N-word lover. Another said, you're no longer a Christian. I don't know where that came from exactly, but somehow in talking about this, that was the sense that family member had. It was a really rude awakening for these students. Christina Cleveland says you start talking about this in a safe space, like a classroom where there's support and you're talking together and really exploring. But the minute you move out into the world, it gets real painful real quick. And it was obvious that these families were not ready for these conversations. There was real blowback when they began to align themselves, these students did, with the concerns of BIPOC people. The week after Thanksgiving, one of those white students came and said, I have loved everything we've done in this class. I feel so strongly about this path that I want to be on, but I'm not gonna. I can't continue. It's too hard. And she explained, she says, my family will disown me. My grandparents are going to cut me off. Her grandparents were helping to pay for college. My friends are going to treat me differently. I can't do it. Do you see what Christina means here about trance? The temptation in trance is to go back to sleep, to go back to coma. It's actually worse than coma if you go back, because you have to be sort of fortified to be able to adopt the kind of amnesia that says, oh, all that stuff that I learned, that I believed, that I understood, I have to act like it's not true. The stuff that you glimpsed, you have to shut your eyes to. Remember the blindfold last week? You put that blindfold back on. And so the way people do that is to reshape their belief systems, their theology, their philosophy, their politics, because otherwise they're not going to be able to sleep at night. So that's where people begin to blame the victim, and they say, oh, the black people created all these problems, and slavery really wasn't all that bad. We've known, some of us have probably been those people. We've glimpsed them in the public square. And I'll say again, like I said last week, no healthy person chooses coma. None of us healthy people would ever choose to just be asleep permanently. There is no freedom in denying what we've glimpsed that was true, even if it's hard. So what's called for at that stage of trance, in order to stay on this path toward freedom, is courage. To get through trance, what we practice is truth-seeking. It's all these books, right? It's what E&J has been about, Equity and Justice, our group through these years. We've been trying to stay on that path, learning and talking together and persisting. The next stage is blitz, which is characterized by desperation. We've seen the truth that we dared to look at, and now we have to do something. This is the what are we going to do about it stage. What's our place in this work? And we approach that with some of what we talked about last week that sort of goes with our, remember I said the life support system that kind of holds us the way we are, this sense of trying harder and doing better. We show up in all our glory and all our strength, all these kind of characteristics of whiteness, the support system that we've been raised with our whole lives. If we just try hard enough, we sort of do a blitzkrieg, we can solve this thing. And it's funny, I never noticed this before, but I see the little bit of this in our gospel reading. When Jesus goes to that temple that day and overturns tables and throws out the money changers, there's kind of this blitz energy. We don't usually read it that way. We kind of look at Jesus doing that and think, wow, he was really putting himself out there, and we kind of see it with a kind of nobility and prophetic kind of thing. His strength kind of comes to us, but there's a kind of wildness in what he does there, and you could read it, and I think we probably don't, but you could say, wow, this was kind of a spur of the moment, I got to do something kind of energy that led him to do this thing that's recorded in all four of the Gospels, so it made a huge impression. That kind of energy is sort of what Christina means by blitz. And as a stage of racial identity, it's something like, I've seen the light and I'm committed to this work, and even if I haven't thought it all through, watch me, I'm going to tackle it. You start blitzing this way, and it's going to be lonely. Your white friends might not agree with what you're doing. You don't have any credibility yet with BIPOC folks. They might know, as Christina puts it, that you mean well, but you haven't healed enough from whiteness to actually do well. So the antidote to that, the practice she suggests, is to be still, to listen. It's a little bit of what you need to do to see what needs to happen. She says when we do that, so much magic and beauty can emerge. And along the way, we're learning a new way to be white in the world. Which brings us to balm. This is where we become last and find our place there. It's a place of healing and connecting with other white people who are quietly, earnestly doing the work that needs to be done. It's a time of coming to understand that racism is a white people problem and taking responsibility for our roles in that and stopping asking BIPOC people to deliver us or to forgive us for all that. The final stage she talks about is awakening, letting go of our need to control the outcome. I want you to notice that it's awakening. It's not awakened. It's not completed. The ing means we're still in process and will be. The farthest you ever get is ing, awakening. And she says this is a stage where think not closed hand, but open, not closed fist, but open hand. This is Jesus ultimately coming to the cross, right? Not fighting, not overturning tables, but surrendering. As we consider where we might find ourselves in this progression toward freedom, what it might take to move closer to liberation, to awakening. That passage we read from Romans comes alongside us and says, take this seriously. We've had in our tradition, our whole Christian tradition includes this sense of things that we ought to be doing to be people of faith. So this passage, which was recommended for this week of this study of the Lent of Liberation, I flinched when I read it because so many words feel pointed at us when we're trying to do this work. Do you feel seen when you read these words? Like living sacrifice and reasonable act of worship and be transformed and follow God's will. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but look at yourselves with sober judgment. Oh, there's so many words there that feel so much about this journey that we're walking during this season. Here's one last story I want to tell to keep this real. That question that someone asked Christina Cleveland back in 2016, what's our place in this? And what did she say? Last. I heard that same question a year ago during the Q&A after a lecture by Nicole Hannah-Jones. You may know her name. She's an Iowa native who was the originator of the 1619 Project that was published in 2019 through the New York Times and has garnered a lot of interest and also a lot of pushback. She was giving a lecture at Iowa State, and so, you know, in the Q&A, she was asked this question, the same question. You know what she said in response? I get asked that all the time. I think every black speaker in a panel like that, it's kind of the kind of question that we bring to it. A lot of well-meaning white people want to know, what are we supposed to do? She didn't say last, actually. She talked for a few minutes about learning and advocacy, and she expressed gratitude for people doing what they could. But then she said, all those good intentions stop short. There's this one word that stops the conversation every time. I'll mention this word, and y'all are going to stop asking. You know what that word was? Reparations. I was sitting in the audience of a few hundred people, and she was right. I felt it in the room. I felt it in my gut. And I thought, this is where trance kicks in, right? Which means that the work that we have to do is truth-seeking and truth-telling, That's what you have to do to move through that, when you feel it in your gut that it's a place you don't want to go. That comment that Nicole Hannah-Jones made led our equity and justice group to this book, Dear White Christians, which is really about reparations. And it's way too much for me to talk about in this moment, but I have to say, and I think the other equity and justice folks would agree with me, it helped us all to see this work of anti-racism so much more clearly. And sometime ask me or any of us, wave your hands if you're one of this group. I don't know if you all know who our people are. It helped us see how we've wimped out as a church and as a society when we've said that what we're really after here is reconciliation, when what's really needed is justice. Reparations is about paying not charity, but a debt that we owe. That's what reparations means to do, and it really is owed, my friends. But there's more on that subject for another day. Love to have that conversation with any of you. This is a conversation that's in the news. Like literally, I've heard it in the news over the last week several times. There's a lot of work in the world happening around reparations and an incredible amount of pushback. But if we're going to be people of justice, I hope you'll look at it, take it seriously. I have some resources I'd be glad to share with you on that. And again, we'd love to talk about it with you from Equity and Justice. William Still wanted his readers to see that those people who escaped enslavement, they were people with real stories and flesh and blood and maybe no toes and scars and tears and also joys and loves, and that they were agents of their own liberation. I created this image on the screen to help us imagine those faces freed, taking wing in that liberation that they were able to find. I think William Still and Elizabeth that he wrote about, and Frederick Douglass and Sherry Mills and Christina Cleveland and Nicole Hannah-Jones and countless others would say, don't stop there. They'd want us to look for our own faces among those others, one body with them in Christ. And us, like them, becoming agents of our own liberation. Fugitives from coma and amnesia and trance by the grace of God, headed step by step toward freedom, awakening. May it be so. Amen.